It's just telling me I'm being recorded, so I'll say continue. But I try and imagine what it would have been like before the lake was there, which is quite hard to do now. But it's not moving on.
You got a problem?
It's not moving on to the next picture. What would that be? Next. I'll go next. Yeah, okay. I might have to do that each time then. So this is the map of 1883, and I've marked off just one or two places on there just to make it clearer. So on the right hand end, you've got Ubley Mill, which is obviously where the lake at the moment finishes. Then you've got the River Yeo running all the way through the valley. Park Bridge, which is the bottom of Park Lane, a station road I've marked on there, and the little road that goes between the two, Dark Lane, which now, if we go down that footpath, we were more or less on the edge of the lake, but that would have been well above it, and then you've carried on down and straight across to the other side via Park Bridge.
You still belong. You're missing the background, so.
So we had a farmed valley, no dwellings in it, river running through it. Why was it taken over? Well, basically Bristol Water, or Bristol, was running out of water and they had to provide more. And so they founded a new company in 1846, which was the Bristol Water Company. And they were to supply water to Bristol. There was some competition for that. One was the Merchant Venturers, which had Brunel in tow, but they were only going to supply to Clifton. There was a huge increase in the population of Bristol and they needed more clean water. And there had been at least 4 cholera epidemics in the 1800s, which killed many hundreds of people, all linked to sewage getting into the drinking water supplies. The plan was to take water initially from the Mendips above the Chew Valley, especially the springs at Chewton Mendip. And there was a feat of engineering which went on to construct what's called the line of works, the pipes and aqueducts which lead up to North Hill Tunnel, gravity fed. When I say go up, it wasn't really up, was it? It was gravity fed, which would supply Barrow, and the tanks up there. The first Barrow tank apparently was built by Irish navvies, and we tend to think that navvies were Irish, but in fact tank 2 and tank 3, and as far as I can see, most of the Blagdon workers weren't Irish, they were English, British. If you go for a walk around Hartree, you can still see this aqueduct. Some of you may well have seen it, and that was in 1846 to 47. Lytton, they built 2 reservoirs there. You can walk around there. It's a lovely walk. In 1850, that was to hold more water. And then tanks at Barrow. You don't often get a chance to see it when you're coming into land from EasyJet. But there are the 3 tanks, and you can see that the road goes through between the 3rd tank and the other 2. They were built over a period of time, 1852 to 1892. However, that wasn't enough water. And so BWC, Bristol Water Company, sometimes called Bristol Water Works, BWW, proposed an 1888 parliamentary bill which would allow them to construct pumping stations at Congsbury and Brinsey, and they would be using water from Rickford and Langford.
There's nothing I can do. I've tried. I've gone round and round and
Underground
round.
extraction from rock layers.
Yes, I heard that.
The company engaged engineers, Thomas Hawksley and his son Charles, to take their plans through Parliament.
Oh.
Okay.
Sorry, Jackie, I'm just muting people again.
Yeah, okay.
They shouldn't be able to unmute themselves.
The local newspapers reported the proceedings of these acts in great detail. You can...
Sorry, hang on.
Position from local landowners. The Duke of Clevedon owned Rington Manor and a good bit of Rickford. Colonel Llewellyn at Langford Court, he was against it. GWR, Axbridge Rural Authority, Benjamin Summers of Mendip Lodge, and a Mr. Brakenbridge of Congressbury, all concerned that if the water was taken from the underground, that the reens and the local wells would all dry up. And it was also agreed that Langford and Rickford water would not be taken below a guaranteed supply, so they would still have enough water. Well, that bill failed. There was such a lot of opposition and petitions and so on raised. So a new bill was proposed in the following year, 1888-9. Mr. Hawksley, the same engineer, took it through Parliament, and this time quite a different plan, building a dam across the River Yeo at Park Bridge. The Yeo rises in Compton Martin, as many of you know, near the church, and flows through the pond there and on to Ugley. So here is the plan. Harness the Yeo rising in Compton Martin, build a dam, huge watershed area, 5,300 acres. Take water from springs at Langford and Rickford while maintaining a flow to those villages and on to Congressbury, and pipe the water from Yeo Reservoir via the line of works to the Barrow Treatment Works. The bill was approved, and including all the necessary provisions for compulsory purchase of land, of which they needed a lot. There are two huge books which I've been looking at in the Bristol Archives Centre at the Create Centre, containing the minutes in great detail of BWC at that time, all handwritten, often in beautiful copperplate. And 5 or 6 directors would meet weekly, virtually, to study and approve all the plans. They retained Thomas Hawksley as their chief engineer to manage, but they were very hands-on. They sometimes overruled him and his plans, put in their own ideas. They had the quality of water approved in June 89, and then Mr. Hawksley and a Bristol surveyor, William Sturge, were instructed to draw up the boundary line and arrange for notices on landholders to be served. They were also tasked with agreeing the prices with the landowners. If they couldn't reach agreement, it would be taken to a jury or arbitration by Frank Wills, who is a cousin of Lord Winterstoke, the Wills of Blagdon. And he was later involved with the design of many buildings locally, the Blagdon farmhouses, but also a lot of the Blagdon waterworks houses. Lord Winterstoke wasn't out of pocket because he was paid £600 for the Rickford mill water, the site of the gauge house, and various easements for pipe work. He was also later a director of Bristol Water. So in 1890, Mr. Hawksley submitted his detailed plans, which were mainly approved, but again, the directors interfered a little bit, and they decided there should be 3 arches in the bridge over the bywash instead of the 5 that he'd designed, and brown tiles instead of slate on the pumping station. They considered at their meetings every land purchase, and if they accepted the prices that had been agreed, they put their company seal on the agreement. It looks from all the details that were in there, I didn't go into every one, but it looks as though around £1,000 was paid for 15 acres. Sometimes the amounts were larger, sometimes smaller, according to the, I guess, the quality of the land. It was agreed that the main contract should be put out to tender, and it was to be completed by the end of 1893, a date worth remembering. It was decided that they wouldn't advertise locally. I'm not quite sure why that was, but it was decided not to tender locally. So the contracts. Oh, I should have mentioned this map before. Sorry, this is the plan that was to go for the whole of the reservoir. I'll come back to that one later. Contracts were with chief engineers, Thomas and Charles Hawksley. They were based in Westminster and very well known. They had worked on all sorts of other projects, quite a prestigious company. They made frequent visits to Blagdon to inspect the works and into Bristol as well to report to the company directors. Thomas Hawksley had been involved in the building of Vyrnwy Dam in Wales, which some of you might have been to. That's him in the corner. That lake reservoir was serving Liverpool, and completed in July 1892. He was involved until 1885, then I think he fell out with the other engineers, and it was taken over by a Liverpool engineer. You can see from the next slide that it was a very different dam to the one we ended up with. Built of stone, the arches were for the overflow of the water, no bywash as we have in Blagdon, which would be an earth bank with a clay core. We'll come back to that later. There is a photograph there of a steam crane, which I come back to later, but it's unusual to find a steam crane at that age. And there are some at the other end of the dam as well. So they were in operation, but it was early days for steam. Back to the contracts, and we had some resident engineers appointed, I think, by the Hawksleys, and they lived in Blagdon. Dawson Kitchingham, for instance, lived in Blagdon House at one time. J.R. Hanna, Joseph Hanna, lived in the shrubbery as it was then, now the old parsonage. There was a resident, Ollis, who was used sometimes for the reservoir, and later on, when they needed a drainage system, Charles Robinson, who lived in Orchard House or lodged in Orchard House, which was a house opposite the Adelaide. You can still see the step that goes up there, but it was taken down by Wills later, and he had his own orchard cottages built up there. The building contractors, who we'll hear quite a bit about afterwards, were the Peck brothers of Plymouth. Father of the company, John, started it, was extremely successful. They took on some huge projects around the country, including waterworks, railways, big buildings. And 4 of his sons took over the business in 1887. In 1895, so after the dam was under construction, but we happened to have the electoral roll for that year, 4 of them were in Blagdon: John, Arthur, Benjamin and Nicholas. The family also owned Swell Tor Granite Quarry on Dartmoor, which proved very useful to them. By 1897, we know that Arthur Henry lived in Yatton, and he seems to be the one who was most concerned with the Blagdon project. They tendered, this was for the dam and the reservoir, £91,350, 13 shillings and 8 pence. And that was accepted in May 1891, with a completion date, as we mentioned before, of 1893. So it was thought it would just take 2 years. Almost immediately, Peck requested an additional 6%, saying that they'd got additional expenses, etc. And that was roundly rejected by the directors in Bristol. And that really set the tone for the subsequent relationship between Peck and the board, usually via Mr. Hawksley. But there was a lot of friction, shall we say, between them all the way through. Dawson Kitchingham came from Yorkshire. He was a civil engineer. Joseph Hanna, name crops up sometimes. He'd been in Canada for a time, but he came back to live in Blagdon. Hodson and Son were a Nottingham company, and they were taken on later when it came to be time to building the pumping station, as opposed to the dam and the reservoir. One of the sons, at least, was a Harry Hodson, and as a 27-year-old, he had a wife and a small child, and they were living in Blagdon. This one, I think you can probably read for yourselves, but it just gives you the specifications of what was expected for the reservoir. 2,000 million gallons, the length of it, 1 3/4 miles. The height of the dam, 43 feet, and the depth at the weir, 37 feet. Pumping station, 2 large houses with 2 engines in each, and a 10-foot brick tunnel taking water under the road from the reservoir into the pumping station. Boiler houses, and the chimney, which of course we only see at a much lower height now. It was 130 feet and very decorative. It was designed to be a real feature. Base of 31 feet square. And then there were coal houses and workshops, etc. at the back. So what did it mean local villages, if you can imagine them at that time, they were very rural places indeed, most people employed on the land. And then suddenly we're getting a huge construction site coming into the village, this enormous lake which is going to be there. They're going to lose farmland. But there's no evidence that we've seen that farmers opposed it. So I can only assume that actually perhaps they were given a fair price for their land. And many of them continued as tenants for the Bristol Water Company, still working their land just as before. Land was also bought, as I'd mentioned before, from Lord Winterstoke for Rickford, and from Benjamin Summers of Mendip Lodge for the Langford Gauge House. Holt Farm, what was one of the nearest farms to the actual water, was one which had to sell off stock due to giving up land. And we've got an auction notice in 1898, which is some way on from the beginning, of him having to sell off his stock. 60 cows, heifers, steers, 28 lambs, all coming up for auction because he no longer had the land on which to keep them. Many of the local farms, Court Farm, for instance, Yew-Tree Farm, Holt Farm, and on the other side, Bellevue, Butcombe and Rugmore were owned and tenanted. The company started selling off some of their estate in the 1950s, and so it went out of ownership of the Bristol Water Company. But I was told recently that while they were owned, all the farm gates had a large W on them or in them. There would have been concern too over the current tracks and paths which just pass straight across the valley up to the other side, and particularly during the construction phase, how people were going to get across. But the parish council minutes don't mention the construction in several years on, so it would appear it wasn't causing a huge problem. Eventually, they were concerned when Dark Lane route across the lake had to close, and they just demanded that it was made wide enough for 2 carts to pass. Accommodation and employment brought really quite some opportunities for work and for making money within the village. It was expected originally, we read somewhere, that 1,000 men would work on the construction site. So that's a huge swelling of the local population. There were probably fewer than that at any one time, but they came from all over the country. Clearly, when you follow them up, following work on other big contracts, they were really itinerant workers. Some were housed in temporary huts, while others took board or lodging in the local homes, source of income, therefore, for the families. Some owned or rented homes in nearby villages, and many of the Blagdon men worked for the construction company while also taking lodgers into their homes, so a double source of income for them. Many more workers came from the surrounding area, villages, and a friend told me recently that she had heard that Bristol men were brought to the bottom of Red Hill, and then they walked in via lie-hole footpaths down to the lake. It was pretty hard work, and there were lots of times of hardship, particularly in the winter, when they could be just laid off. So here they were, stuck in Blagdon, no work, no money. The local rector was Gilbert Lyons at the time, set up a navvies mission to which the Bristol Water Company did contribute. And at one time, the missioner lived in Yew-Tree Cottage in High Street. What we have next are some examples of the people involved, Pritchard and Sturge for the compulsory purchase, Frank Wills arbitrating, farmers continuing as tenants, and the footpaths and the cattle troughs, which had to be maintained while all this was going on and while the land was being lost. The best numbers that we can come up with for the people working was the 1901 census. So this is some time on from the beginning of the work, but it shows us that in Blagdon, and this was just one village of many, of course, there were 18 boarders and 36 lodgers. It's not quite obvious what the difference was, except that possibly it was to do with whether there was a meal involved or whether it was just a room that was let. And then there were temporary huts 5 of them at the time in 1901. There may have been more before that, plus 2 houses that were temporary, and quite a lot of men found sleeping out. This is an example of one of the navvies' huts. They tended to have a head with a wife who it looks as if would probably be doing the domestic duties for the whole hut. In this particular case, the Wildings were there with 3 children, son, daughter, and another son, younger one. And the men were all involved in working on the railway, because by that time, the light railway had come through to Blagdon. But you can see from where they were born, Richard Wilding was born in Preston. His wife was born in Ledbury, so he probably met her when he was working elsewhere. And each of their 3 children were born in different places, suggesting that they had moved around quite a lot. And in their hut, they had all these boarders, some working on the railway, but others were navvies. And it's quite interesting just to look at where they came from. Quite a few Somerset. So only one actually from Blagdon who was boarding down there. Going back to the men who were sleeping out, John Gallup's grandmother remembered navvies sleeping out in barns, and she allowed them to sleep in her barn overnight. But apparently she always took their matches off them before they went to sleep. Initially, the work would have been manual labour, mainly done by the navvies, but by 1901, they'd been joined by more skilled men, although not on this actual list of this particular one here, because the masonry and the bricklaying would have started on the finished dam by then. Richard Wilding, interestingly, the head of this house, didn't go on another contract. He went on to live in Shirehampton, and he and his wife were running a grocery shop. So he obviously liked the area, but perhaps decided to get out of construction. Another hut had Emmanuel Cornish in it. He was the head of the hut, and he was a navvy foreman. He was actually relatively local, Somerset, but he'd been right away, and he'd met his wife in Cheshire, and they'd got 2 youngsters living with them. When he was in Cheshire, he was an excavator, so perhaps very similar work to what was happening in the Blagdon construction. And he had all excavators living with him, and they were from Worcestershire, Leicestershire, and Somerset, so fairly far flung. And in 1895, so before he was in this hut, he was actually on the Blagdon electoral roll, suggesting he was living in a house at that time. He and Agnes married in 1889, sorry, and in his hut were all these lodgers. But just look at the ages of them. They were all widowers or single, but we've got 56, 55, 60, 65, still working as navvies, really hard work. Emmanuel Cornish actually died in an accident later on that year in 1901, but not at work. He was coming back from Wells, apparently, been to Wells Market in his pony and trap with some others, and he'd let them off when they got to their homes. And he was coming back down Dark Lane when it overturned, and he was thrown out and killed. And he is buried in Blagdon Church. It's a wonderful picture, I always think. It's from Adicot's archive. It's not labelled, so we don't know exactly where it was. We think it was probably in the trench that had to be dug under the dam. But there's if you think about what it would look like in a construction site today, all the high-vis and the helmets and the mechanical tools, there they are. Many of them in waistcoats, which apparently was something that navvies often like to wear, with their shovels. Interesting picture. This is quite instructive in a way as well, because it shows the different occupations that there were in 1901 This is the census information compared to 1911. So you can see some occupations go down, like blacksmiths. They were employed on the construction work, were then no longer needed. Bricklayers, all building the pumping station, then very few in 1911. We don't use bricks much in Blagdon. Carpenters, hauliers, all going down. Engineers, not so much, they were still needed. And the engine stokers and engine fitters, they were still around because the railway was employing them. Labourers stays very similar, but I think that's because of the agricultural labourers there would still have been in 1911. But navvies, look, goes from 67 to 0. Quarry workers the same. The school was very affected, as you can imagine, because some of the families, not those in the huts particularly, but others who came into work and found lodgings, sent their children to the local school. And in 1891, which was just before the work started, there were 105 on roll. By 1898, it had gone up to 180. And you can imagine in the little Blagdon buildings, that was very overcrowded. There was considerable worry in the head teacher's logbook about what happened whenever there was an inspection and so on. In 1893, the leaving age was 11, so they could go then, but it went up to 13 in 1899. There's a quote in 1900 from the local rector, Gilbert Lyons again, and to quote, 44 imported children and about 30 whose parents were villagers but who might migrate when work was no longer to be found. And indeed, by October 1902, the roll had dropped considerably and down to 120 in 1903. But it must have been quite a headache with those children all coming from different areas of the country, probably, been to different schools, different experiences and so on. So the early work, 1889 to 1898. So the first job was to construct the dam. And the first thing that had to happen was the puddle gutter. We hear a lot about this puddle gutter. Basically, it was a very deep trench that had to be dug so that firm foundations could be found to build an earth and clay embankment. Originally, the puddle gutter was going to be 39 feet deep, and work began in 1891 in the summer, but by January, the engineer had reported that the trench would have to be wider and deeper. They still hadn't reached rock. The directors haggled with the builders Peck over the extra cost of carrying on building down. And in July of that year, so that's another sort of 6 months on, they resolved to dig a trial pit and further boreholes. So no more digging going on yet of the whole trench. And Peck requested more advance money. And also he wanted further projects to keep his workforce employed while the dispute was arbitrated. And it wasn't until March 1893 that it was agreed how much he would be paid and that the trench would be further excavated. During this time, Thomas Hawksley had died, the chief engineer, and his son Charles was now in charge. And in February 1894, so after the original finished supposed date for the whole thing, he reported that there was now a good retentive bottom on Red Marl Rock, but it was 170 feet down, as opposed to the original 39 feet they were expecting. At the time, it was the deepest trench anywhere in England. And he reported that now, having reached the marl, they needed to put in concrete ends to retain the puddle clay core of the embankment. And there were several accidents when men fell into this very deep gutter. There was also at one time a flood after huge rainfall in 1894, which flowed into this gutter and required pumping out. And this resulted in men being put out of work because there was nothing for them to do until it had been pumped. A very hard winter followed that, and many men were unemployed, and suffering hardship. And there's a story reported in the press of the time of men borrowing a cart and dragging it to Sandford Station, the nearest station at the time. and hauling coal back. The company, with Pevics in tow, set up a fund to supply soup and bread and some tickets for groceries. A committee in Blagdon village, a coal committee, was set up, and there was various charitable giving to try and keep them going. Here, of hauling the coal. A lot of men involved, and apparently those who were still working contributed to the fund to enable them to go. And I don't think they were given the coal, they had to buy the coal and bring it back. Progress continued to be very slow, and the director's minutes show huge frustration. In 1896, so this is 3 years after it was supposed to have finished, they were thoroughly dissatisfied. And they rather suspected that Peck was working on other projects, such as the Welsh Railway, which could well be true because they were involved in that project. Charles Hawksley reported frequently and was the go-between between Peck and all the local engineers and surveyors. And he, in the end, was not satisfied himself with Peck's progress. But all this time, Peck is claiming he needs more money for the extra expense of still being working. Once the embankment was finally finished, the masonry phase started, when they had to face the sides, pitching as the banks were called. And then it was all held up by lack of stone supplies, and that crops up again and again in the minutes. What were they going to do about stone? Where would it come from? Could they use something different? The choices were Cheddar and Titherington limestone, Forest of Dean stone, which is sandstone, and granite. And of course, the Pecks had their own granite quarry. The weir stones were to be of granite, and other ashlar, which is the finely cut blocks, which are used all along the road and the walls, were Forest of Dean stone. At one point, Peck suggested perhaps using cement concrete blocks for the pitching, in other words, the banks on either side of the embankment. But the board didn't like that idea, and they agreed to pay extra for stone, but they reduced the size of the granite blocks that were to be used to try and save a bit of money. The stonework originally was going to be finished by 1899, or penalties would be issued. So this is 6 years on from the original hoped for finish date. Initially, horses were used for hauling materials, including from the nearest station at Sandford. There's a reference to stables being on site down by the construction somewhere, and many local hauliers were very busy using their teams of horses. Once the steam engines came in, then there were less horses being used, and steam power started in the 1890s and gradually became more and more. There's a picture here of obviously a steamroller traction engine. That's a 1901 traction engine. The crane, I'm afraid I don't know the actual date of, but I think it's a pretty early one. So that would have been one of the early ones to be used, I would imagine. There was a local man who was William Pierce. He was known as Jumbo because he was quite a big chap. He was a steam crane driver. And there's a story later that he lowered the young son of the BWC company secretary, director, Mr. Alexander, down in his bucket so that he could view the puddle gutter. And that boy later grew up to be managing director of BWC himself. And later on, of course, more steam power when the engines were installed. There's a story that in 1895, a new steamroller got stuck in a paddock opposite the Seymour Arms overnight and had to be hauled out by a Peck traction engine. Subsequently collided with the stable wall of the pub, doing considerable damage to the wall and itself. The traction engines did a lot of damage to the local roads with their iron wheels. That comes up several times. Complaints about the getting through from Blagdon to Rickford became impassable at one point, and through from Rinkton, lots of complaints about what they did to the roads. Once the embankment was finished, before that, there's a picture of George King, who lived in Seaview up Sladacre Lane. He was a very well-known character. And in '61, the Cheddar Valley Gazette did an article about him when his wife and he were in their 80s. And it talks about George working with horses on the building of the lake. He was later employed by 5 generations of the Wills family. Once the bank was in place and the pumping station was going to be started, there was a need for more skilled labour, so not just navvies. And so Hodson now is involved looking for bricklayers, scaffolders, masons, banker hands. Somebody might be able to tell me quite what a banker hand does, but it's obviously working with stone in some way. Stone sawyers. And you can see the sort of what they were earning. If you were a mason, it could be 9.5 pence per hour. If you were just a sawyer, it's 6.5 pence per hour. Bricklayers, 8.5 pence per hour. And these adverts didn't appear locally in the Bristol papers. Nottingham Journal, which of course is where Hodson's came from, the Gloucester Citizen, Cambridge Daily News, they were all looking for people, but nothing from Bristol papers. The newspapers have proved to be extremely valuable as evidence for what was going on, not just on the dam, but for all sorts of things that we've been researching for Blagdon local history. But there was a great deal written in the press at the time, progress reports on what was happening on the reservoir and the dam, generally very, very appreciative of what the engineering involved. And this was going to be a marvelous event, if you like, when it all came into fruition, and they're very praising of it. However, there were accidents, as you might expect, in a no health and safety environment, and they were also reported in the local press. And alongside that, they give some evidence of how the work was being carried out and what machinery was being used and so on. And sometimes there are very, very lengthy inquest reports of exactly who said what, which give us some insight into what was going on. These are some of the accidents that happened. Starting in 1892, a couple of men were burned from blasting rock. People fell in the puddle gutter. Stone breaking machine was involved. Somebody else had a badly fractured leg. Davis in 1896 was a young lad. A lot of these were quite young boys working in the clay field. And apparently he took a shortcut and ducked under a machine and got a very bad head injury. James Cann, who was only 13, it doesn't actually say what his accident was. He met with an accident. Some of these, clearly, the initial report just tells us that they were very badly injured and were taken off to hospital. We don't always know whether they were fatal injuries or not. Richard Wilding, no relation as far as I can see to the Wilding in the hut, was a young child who was drowned, blown into the lake. There's a couple of things with traction engines when we get to 1897, getting trapped between the wheels of trolleys and so on. The quarry accident at the end, we're not quite sure whether that accident was, whether the quarry was to do with Bristol Water or whether it was a local quarry, because there would have been others providing stone for lime and for building stone. So what did we learn from the accident? The puddle gutter was one of the main things. In 1893, for instance, John Fear, a 27-year-old horse driver, died after falling 67 feet into the gutter after dark. At his inquest, it was suggested a light should be permanently lit at either end of the footbridge after sunset. He was buried in Blagdon Church, and Peck brothers did pay for his funeral, and 200 attended, including most of the men from the site, suggesting that there were several hundred working there at the time. 2 other men, Hayward, who was severely injured falling 70 feet, We don't know whether he did die eventually, and Russell also injured. They were all working in the gutter. Clay was puddled into a soft water-resisting mix, and this was put inside the earth dam. And a mill is mentioned in the head injury of a lad who'd been collecting wood for the engine, took a shortcut under the belt which drove the machine, and it's not too nice to think about, and the outcome of that is not known. Stoneworking, as I mentioned, quarries would be involved, but there was the two badly burned when gunpowder they were using to blast rocks at the Yo site exploded. And we've also talked about the stone breaking machine. I think the stone was broken up before the clay was puddled. There was a lot of haulage of heavy materials to be done, including from Sandford Station, and the iron wheels just played havoc with the local roads. When the road over the dam opened, there was still a lot of other construction going on, and there were still more complaints about the condition of that. A man called Thomas Hamblin died of his injuries after falling under the wheels of two trucks that were being hauled by traction engine from Sandford. And again, it seems sometimes these are young lads who think they'll just sit on the front of the truck or balance on the engine somewhere, just not safely, but they died for their efforts. Steam cranes were introduced early on for some of the heavy lifting work on the puddle gutter. And in 1896, there was a 13-year-old, James Cann, who was called a hitcher on, something to do with hitching on the bucket, I think, or trucks that were coming along. And he'd been riding on the front of the crane. His foot was caught, fell on the rails and was run. A widely reported death was of a local boy, a 14-year-old Frederick Lyons, which I'll come to in a moment. And then there was drowning. We mentioned the young boy who was blown in, but there were also a couple of horses that got stuck in the water and drowned too. If you go to Lake Vyrnwy, you'll see a plaque there at the end of the dam, which pays tribute to 44 workers who lost their lives. But we've got no record for Yo Reservoir. We don't actually know how many died. Fred Lyons then, he was the brother of Jacob Lyons, who was the founder of Mendip Garage. So he was working down there to do with the steam cranes. He was moving trucks along to put them in the right place, I think. Steam crane brake failed while it was hoisting a skip of wet mud. This was very, very widely reported in the local paper, and the contractor, Mr. Peck, gave evidence, and some of his evidence explains what was going on. So I have put this newspaper article up. It's pretty poor, so I'll read it because it is difficult to read. Arthur Henry Peck of Blagdon said that he was a partner in the firm of Peck Brothers, contractors of Plymouth. They were excavating puddle trenches for the waterworks at Blagdon. Explaining, witness said a puddle trench varied in width from 9 to 13 feet and in depth from 80 to 180 feet. The object of going so deep was to procure a watertight strata. The trench had then to be filled with puddle clay so as to dam the water back and form one side of the reservoir. In excavating the trench in question, they employed 5 cranes running at the side on rails. The cranes hoisted up the excavated material by means of a bucket, which was swung round and tipped by the banksman into a wagon. The crane concerned in the accident was not quite 2 years old. A man named Davis, who had the management of the crane, had been employed by the firm for about 2 years and was very trustworthy. But in this case, the bucket had not been exactly above the wagon, and it knocked Fred onto the rails. And it's clear from many reports that not only were some of the workers very young, but they did sometimes take shortcuts, as I mentioned, and put themselves in considerable danger. So we move on from the excavating of the actual dam and the stonework on it to the other things that had to happen. So this was all between 1889 and 1905, but obviously these things overlapped. So it's not that one happened after the other. The new road was under discussion in July 1899 as to what should be used for the channelling, the gutters, either side of the road. Again, they were unable to get the stone they wanted, and so Peck suggested that he could use granite, but it would cost an extra shilling a foot. And if the directors agreed to that, he could complete by the end of September. They weren't too keen, but in the end, that did happen. And until traffic could use the road, as he pointed out, the water could not be impounded because they couldn't close the footpaths that went across the valley. He requested already the closure of Dark Lane because that would need to be rerouted to join the embankment road. And the parish council agreed to that. That September date, when he'd said it could be finished, was inevitably extended to November. And finally, the valves could be closed in 1899 to start filling the lake. In October of that year, the road is open but unfinished, and it wasn't actually finally metalled until 1901. Interestingly, we've got another sort of report that in 1899, when the valves were closed, that there was a big ceremony on the dam, as you might expect, but there's nothing in the director's minutes about that, which is a bit strange, really. Anyway, the pumping station, quotes were asked for, tenders put out, and Peck again quoted, but this time he didn't get it. This time it went to Hodson, son of Nottingham, and they quoted nearly 24,000 to build that. But inevitably, they found that the foundations for the engine houses needed to be deeper, and they needed to put in extra ironwork to support the very, very heavy engines that would be going in. The buildings were mainly brick with stone surrounds, but again, there was a shortage of stone. And so this time, Hodson was asking if he could use Dundry stone instead of Dalting, which happened. In 1905, there's an intriguing minute that the floors in the engine houses had to be replaced. It doesn't say why. So another 6 to 8 weeks of work went into replacing them. Later on, they also put in a weighbridge for the incoming coal. The pipework started some time back in 1896, bringing the water, or to bring the water when they were ready, from Rickford and Langford. From Rickford, it falls by gravity into the reservoir. The Langford is piped, Langford water, piped to the pumping station. The people in Rickford were going to miss their dipping place, which they'd always had by the, I don't know whether it was by the spring or by the pond, but it was agreed they should have a pump put in there. And despite the board's dissatisfaction with Peck, they continued to give them further contracts for pipe laying, strengthening the piers needed for the additional pipe where it joined the line of works, and later for the drainage works. It's noticeable that Peck usually turned in low tenders. He obviously wanted the work, and the directors carried on going for the cheapest price. There's a note in September 1897 that there are now 300 men engaged on the work, so they really were trying to get on with it, it seems. Charles Hawksley, the engineer, was to make recommendations about the beam engines that should be used. He took a long time deciding exactly what was needed. In the end, he came up with the recommendation that there should be 4, somebody will understand what all this means, compound rotative beam engines with Lancashire double flue boilers, coal-fired. And interestingly, the chairman of the directors dissented. He'd actually wanted gas power, but it went through as being coal. The initial tender that went out failed after some time because that company became insolvent, and so it went out again, and eventually it went to Glenfield of Kilmarnock, and their tender was accepted, £31,000 in 1899, but it was not until 1904 that the engines actually went in. Unfortunately, in October of 1904, apparently in the minutes, Mr. Hawksley, engineer, arrived to inspect the engines to find that a pipe main had burst, a pumping main. So there was a further delay of 2 to 3 weeks. It's really the story of this project. However, the lake had been filling from 1899 when the valves were closed, and it was declared full in January 1903. However, it wasn't until December in 1904 that finally the quality of the water was approved and they started pumping the water to Barrow. All 4 engines on the 9th of December pumped to North Hill, and then the water gravitated to Barrow Reservoir. 16 revolutions per minute, 8 million gallons in 22 hours. Something else which had to go in was drainage, because they didn't want the lake being polluted by local sewage and runoff. And so a new scheme had to be devised, and a Mr. Robinson was engaged. He's the one who lodged in Orchard House. And he presented plans for sewage tanks in Blagdon, Ubley and Compton Martin, which would then pipe to a drainage works to be built near the proposed railway station behind the pumping works. Effluent from that would thereafter flow into the river. So this was below the dam now, so it didn't matter so much what went into the river. Privies were not included in the scheme, so people had to empty their own privies still, I don't know where. And farmers would need separate septic tanks, but they were allowed to put the overflow on their fields. So in 1903, septic tanks went in, and in 1905, it was still all going along, and there were fortnightly reports from Mr. Robinson about how it was working. And then a drainage inspector was appointed, Mr. Ladbroke, and he stayed on until 1929. He lived in Ubley Villa, and he had an official office in that house. The railway, which was to be extended to Rington to Blagdon, was obviously a way of bringing in coal, and BWC negotiated for the sidings to come right up to the boiler house with coal. Much wrangling over the costs with GWR and who was going to provide further maintenance, etc. The railway had actually come through to Blagdon in 1901. And so building materials and people were still coming through to Blagdon, but the coal sidings were a bit later. Filling the lake, it obviously took a long time. And one of the tasks that had to happen before that could be done was to scour the lake bottom. This was Mr. Peck's job. And he had to fell all the trees as specified that would be in the way and remove only those needed for construction. I guess possibly BWC hoped to sell the rest, but Mr. Peck stated they were all needed for construction and he kept them all. So all through the 1900s, there was more land being acquired from the local farms. And some of the lower fields actually needed extra drainage because of the lake water, they weren't now draining as they would have done and down into the valley bottom. And so they had to put in more drainage. There was a lot of cost involved in keeping these farms going and looking after their land. So Bristol Water actually were huge landowners. It's a really large estate that they had. In 1888, Hawksley was asked to plan 2 ornamental and picturesque houses to be erected on the north and south sides. But only the southern one, was to include a boardroom of not less than 28 feet by 18 feet. Subsequently, only this one was built, which is what we now know as the inspection house. Prior to that, the directors had met at Orchard House before that was demolished. In 1902, Frank Wills was asked to put in plans to build an engineer's house near the pumping station. It was to have a parlour, kitchen, scullery, 3 bedrooms and a bathroom. And later, a year later, he was asked to build to plan 2 workmen's cottages. These are the cottages that are at the end of Garston Lane. And Millier and Son of Rickford were awarded both contracts. The following year, 4 more workers' cottages were built at right angles to the first 2, so the ones facing Garstons now, and named as Yew Tree Cottages. There was some discussion early on about supplying all the company houses with piped water. The rest of Blagdon didn't get any piped water. In fact, they didn't get standpipes until 1908, which were supplied by a spring on Mendip. The building materials were clearly Victorian strength, written all through them. The board were very keen to have it looking as a very solid construction. So the bywash masonry, the Cheddar and Titherington stone, the bridge over the bywash and the ornamental pillars, Forest of Dean sandstone, the inner slopes of the embankment and the road gutters were granite, and then pumping station, Shortwood and Cattybrook bricks with Dundry stone dressings. And this is interesting, although I know it's an area which would have cement, but 7,000 tonnes of cement, mainly from Kent. Can you imagine transporting the weight of that from Kent? Some of the masonry work which where this stone was used. So you've got on the right, the gutters, the big curbstones and the gutter stones of granite. Got the pillars. That is the pillar on the bridge over the bywash. And then you've got the pitching, the side of the embankment. And then the walls that run along the side of the road, a different style at the top to the ones on the bridge. All beautifully made and all still there and very intact. So we've got under construction, scaffolding being used there. One of the boiler houses complete on the right hand side, and later on the other one goes up identically, completely symmetrical. And you can see the big tanks in the front, the holding tanks. So the water flowed under the road into those holding tanks, which later were used for fish, as some people will remember. There's some quite early photographs. We think probably 1920s possibly, but you can see the difference in the sides. No trees virtually, and there's a little carriage on the top there, but still not metalled by the look of it. So perhaps this was earlier actually, if it's not properly metalled yet. And the lake's still not full in that picture on the bottom right, showing the new road. It became very popular to come out and take photographs. Some of them were made into postcards. People would come out and have a look, send the postcards to their friends. We've got some which are written on the back. These two sketches appeared in a newspaper report of 1902. So showing the three arches under the bridge, which you can't really see, of course, when you're on top of the bridge. And then other buildings, again, very ornate buildings. They wanted to have this sort of Gothic Tudor look to their buildings. The little one at the top is the meter house, which is still there on the side of the lake, is now a bat sanctuary. The other two are the gauge houses over the streams in Langford and Rickford, which are very much still there and in use. You can see them over the water. Water rushes straight through underneath. And that would be a postcard again of a completed pumping station with, as you can see, a very ornate tower, 130 feet high. It was reduced to 60 feet in 1954 after a couple of the engines were electrified, so they were no longer needing the same height of chimney. Here's one of the beautiful beam engines. There were four, obviously, originally. In 1904, they pumped from 1904 to 1949. And in 1949, two of them were replaced by electric pumps. The last running on steam was apparently in 1953. But two of the engines were kept and restored in beautiful condition, and it attracted many visitors on steam days. Many of us can remember those days when the pumping station was open, and on certain days you could see them working. Fantastic machinery. The company also planted specimen trees and created a nature trail, which was also open to visitors on those days. Sadly, that's all closed now. There are no current plans to reopen it, unfortunately, because there are various artifacts in there as well, as you can see on the wall, pictures, sketches, etc., none of which we can see now. This is one of the maps or plans that Bristol Water had produced. And you can see there are some really quite interesting features on there, because you can obviously see the dam, and you've got the bywash coming down here back into the river, and the river snakes on down through here. Uxford Bridge was one of the original crossing points on the river. The line from Rickford comes through, and then I think it gets diverted down through here. And on the next slide, you'll see that it comes out actually into the lake. You've got the railway coming in, the light railway coming mainly down here and down to the station, but you've got the sidings which came right in to the back of the boiler houses, bringing in the coal. The drainage works was built here, and just tucked in here, engineer's house. That's now called Lakewood. I think I've got that right. I've got it written down somewhere later on. Lakewood House. And the engineer had his own sort of footpath in to do his work in the pumping station grounds. The inspection house is down here. It was on quite a rise, as you'll see in one or two later pictures. Really was able to inspect everything. And you've got Blagdon Station just down here, the light railway coming in. Slightly different shot this time, and this one does show into the river, into the lake, sorry, not river, the inlet from Rington. So it came, Rickford, it went in there, and then it presumably flowed back through underneath the road into the pumping station. There are various, there's the inspection house again. This one's also got the angling house, the fishing lodge as we tend to call it now, but angler's house they called it. And this one shows quite clearly that the pipeline, which was originally planned as a double line, but it became a single line, flowed down south of the lake. And you can see the contours there, the depth of the water. It's roughly, the edge of the lake is roughly on 150. And finally, this one, if you know the area, this is Breach Hill, going up through here. The pipe from Blagdon has come south of the lake, and then it flows through the valley below. There's Manor Farm there. And then this line here is the other line of works that's coming from Mendip, Heron's Green. And they join just up here, and then they continue together up to Barrow. Nine men worked in the pumping station as a team, plus the engineer foreman. He was a chap called Charlie Williams, appointed in 1904. He'd been a marine engineer. He stayed with the company for 10 years and then he moved on. He got a fortnight's holiday per year and £3 a week. 9 men under him, they worked in shifts, but there were 3 engine drivers, 3 stokers, 2 coal trimmers and 1 dayman. There wasn't pumping going on all the time, but when they were pumping, they did 10-hour shifts, slightly shorter when they weren't pumping. After the 10 hours, they had overtime, 1.5 times if they worked on Sundays and double on holidays, and they had 8 days holiday a year. There were many more men working for the company in other roles, and when the company started to need more men to run the whole system, some of the men were moved from the Chelvey works. In 1905, they started building up their main men. And there's a very interesting book in the Bristol archives listing every man that worked for them, every time he had a pay rise, where he went next, etc. The men who moved from Chelvey were actually given £2 for their expenses of moving. As an example, in 1905, Lot Weeks was a fireman at the pumping station, and he was paid 3 shillings a week. He paid 3 shillings a week for 3 yew tree cottages. So he lived in one of them as a waterworks man, and he paid 3 shillings a week. Another long-serving worker on the drainage scheme lived in the inspection house. He lived there for 30+ years, Theodore Launday Matthews. And he stayed on as caretaker until he was pensioned off in 1937. After that, the Murdoch family moved in as caretakers, rent-free, because they worked for the company, and Mrs. Murdoch would look after the directors when they came down. If they had a meeting, she would cook meals. Some of them brought friends to stay there. She would do that. One of their daughters, Kath Day, recalled that her father had come as a gillie from Scotland. Now, in fact, virtually all the original gillies who looked after the fishing on the lake came from Scotland. But a job with the BWW was considered to be a job for life, and we've got lots of obituaries of men working there for 40 years plus. Light railway came through, and this picture shows you the trucks that presumably would have gone on maybe to the sidings or come up from the sidings. And there's the inspection house. Now, as you know, it's virtually shrouded with trees, big trees that have grown up, but there it was on a hill, which was almost denuded of any foliage at all. So in 1904, the company agreed that there would be fishing in the lake, and they set up certain regulations in that time, no detail in the minutes of what those were. And fishermen and visitors could have access to the inspection house as long as they had a director or a general manager with them. They also agreed to erect a fish hatchery at Ubley. That cost them £120 apparently. More of that in a minute. And H. Wills, who was a Wills, one of the wider family, lived in Barley Wood. He requested duck shooting, placing his own keepers and boat on the lake. He was turned down initially, but later in October 1905, it was agreed that he could pay £50 for the wild fowl shooting. So the lake became famous for its fishing. And I'm not going to go a great deal into that here, because this was mainly about the construction of the dam and the reservoir. But it became very famous not only for fishing, but also for its bird life, presumably after the shooting stopped. And Sheila has a feeling that might have been something to do with an intervention by Peter Scott. I'm not sure. But people coming down for the fishing was wonderful for the village. Local residents offered lodgings. All the local inns were taking in fishermen. And there were many day visitors needing sustenance as well. And at one time, this was on offer in the fishing lodge itself. Again, another very Tudor-looking style building. And Annie Pierce, who had married Jumbo Pierce, who we mentioned before as being the steam crane driver, lived in one of the huts initially with 2 children. But after he was invalided, she provided food and drink for many years in the fishing lodge, as she was the main breadwinner. So I mentioned the original gillies coming from Scotland. The first one was Donald Carr, and you can see him in the front of the picture on the left. He arrived in 1903 as the first lake ranger, and he was the one who built the trout hatchery in Ubley. He retired in 1938. He lived in the mill at Ubley, and he laid out the beautiful gardens there. He became really quite famous because some very famous people came to fish on the lake, and they all appreciated his expertise and the welcome they were given. In fact, one very grateful William Morris actually gave him a car. Jim Murdoch, who is second left in that picture, went on to live in the inspection house. As I mentioned, he was the caretaker, but he was also a gillie. And he was the last gillie to be employed by Bristol Water when he retired in 1968. His son married Monica Monk, who many people knew as Monica Murdoch, who sadly died a couple of years ago. There's lots of history to the development of the fishing. There's a book by Christopher Ogborn, which some people have mentioned, but also the latest newsletter that we've produced as a society, Blagdon Life and Times. is on our website if you haven't received it as a member, or you can request it from Mike Adams. And it gives a really good overview of the fishing and some of the stories that went with it. Really interesting read. So have a look at that. The website down the bottom there, Blagdon LHS, Local History Society.com. One of the people who came to work at the lake as a blacksmith stayed on, Charlie Simpkins. He was quite a character. Lots of people knew about him. In fact, there's a little newspaper report about him, and I think it was Arthur Filer, who was a local man, running a race when they were working down at the dam. So there were some sort of leisure activities, if you could call them that, or competitive activities put on, and these men would sprint and race each other. He had a little carriage cart and a horse, and we think possibly the building behind him, which is also in the picture on the left, the low building, was one of the original navvies' huts, but nobody's quite sure about that. But he turned it into accommodation for visitors and tea rooms. There's his wife just behind the horse. She ran the tea room. And he would fetch people from the station, take them up into the village or on beyond. They were going up onto Mendip, which was also very popular for tourists. And he would also pick up parcels for people from the station, take those up into the village. And you can see in the picture on the left, the inspection house there. I'm not going to go a lot further, but there was a couple of interesting pictures that I thought it would be just nice to put in. In 1934, was a drought in the valley, and although it's a very, very grainy picture, what you're looking at there at the top is people with horses and carts, and apparently they were digging silt from where the lake would have been. The lake had dried out. Now, I'm not clear whether they were doing it for Bristol Water because they wanted the silt to be cleared to make the lake deeper, or whether actually they were allowed to come and get the silt for their own purposes, as it was probably fairly nutritious stuff. And the little one on the right, again, this bridge became visible during the drought. We're not quite sure which one it was. There were a couple more bridges opposite Rugmore and another one in that direction too. It may be one of those. It looks quite a small bridge, just a footbridge. I don't think it's the sort that you would have been able to take horses and carts over, but I could be wrong. So they're just rather fascinating pictures. So my thanks to all these people who've, Sheila Johnson has got this amazing memory and archive in her brain as well as in her computer. Photo collections, some of them are held by Blagdon Local History Society in the archive, and some that have been given more recently, Sally Humphreys, for instance, in Lakewood House. And the Bristol Archive Centre, who provided the maps that I showed you in the Create Centre, and I was able to go and look at the minutes there as well. So I'd be very happy if Andrew likes to allow people's mics to go back on. To hear any comments, questions I may not be able to answer, but if Sheila comes in, she may be able to. But also if anybody has memories or comments, then be delighted to hear them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jackie. That was absolutely fantastic. I have learnt so much in the last hour and a half. It is really tremendous. And you've had several very complimentary messages come through from people as well.
Oh, thank you.
So that is really lovely. I've allowed people now, I think, to unmute themselves. So if anybody wants to ask any questions or make any comments, I think if people press this, I think they can press unmute themselves and ask Jackie questions or make comments or whatever. So open to anybody.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we
Yes.
can.
May I ask a question? Steve Ward from Hartree History Society. Absolutely superb talk, lovely slides. It was really, really interesting. Has anybody got any idea when it stopped being called Yo Reservoir and started being called Blagdon Lake?
No, I don't have a date for that. I don't know whether it's partly to do with when the fishing started, whether it became known as Blagdon Lake then. I don't know.
Right.
Interesting. Actually, there was one thing I was going to say about the future, because I did email Blagdon Water, Bristol Water rather, as they are now. And of course, they've got another, they belong to some other company now as well, about what their future was and whether we would be able to get back into the pumping station. And the message I had back was that Bristol Water are no longer going to provide the fishing at the lake, and South West Lakes Trust are being brought in to take over providing fishing at our lakes. Until we know what South West Lakes Trust are planning to provide, there will be no decisions being made on the regeneration of Blagdon Pumping Station and Blagdon Lake, which is rather sad.
Okay, thank you.
Can I come in with a question, please?
Yes, thank you.
Richard Ivans. Unfortunately, I had to go out for 15 minutes during your talk, so I don't know whether I'm going to talk about things that you've dealt with already. But one of the essential works, of course, when they built the reservoir, was to deal with the drainage from Blagdon village.
Yes.
Did you deal with this at all?
Yes, we did mention there had to be septic tanks put in and draining down to the drainage works, which was built behind the pumping station.
Yes, it did. Certainly back in, I mean, I worked for the local authority back in the 1960s, 70s and 80s. Well,
yes.
Until the 90s, in fact. And in the early days of Axbridge RDC, we looked after the drainage in Blagdon, amongst other things. And Bristol Waterworks looked after the treatment works. Certainly before the reservoir was constructed, about 1900, hardly any villages the size of Blagdon had any drainage schemes to speak of at all. And most foul drainage went straight into ditches, often without septic tanks. And even with septic tanks, there would be effluent to deal with. And so the drainage scheme that was put in conjunction with the lake took all of the foul drainage to the treatment works, which was, of course, downstream from the reservoir. And
yes.
The site engineer, which was presumably C.E. Robinson, who was presumably looking after that side of the drainage,
yes,
had field books which recorded, of course, where all the junctions were for the various houses.
Oh, yes.
And these were interspersed with pencil drawings of a lot of the properties in the village. Which
Oh,
was
really?
obviously an interest of his, completely unrelated to the work. So
yes.
he obviously spent a lot of time in certain locations just sketching the properties. And these were superb drawings. Whether they still exist or not, I don't know. But if they do exist, they will be somewhere in a warehouse under the control of Wessex Water. And I doubt if they would have the idea where
shame.
they were.
Yes.
So that's that. If I could comment on another aspect, the relationship between Pethics and Bristol Water.
Yes.
And the question of claims that were being made against the company. Certainly, when they designed the reservoir, they must have done very limited site investigation, because if they thought they were going to get away with a cut-off curtain wall 39 feet deep, they clearly hadn't done any deep site investigation.
No.
And so the first thing that happens when you start digging in the ground is invariably you find things that you didn't expect. These days, of course, we put down boreholes and we'd have a fairly detailed profile of what the ground was. But certainly when they were building the reservoir, I mean, they were jolly lucky that they eventually bottomed out where they did. Otherwise, they could have gone on almost indefinitely.
Yes.
And the contractor clearly was faced with a job on a scale well in excess of what he had anticipated.
Yes.
So the contract almost certainly would have been somewhat similar to ones we were running in the 60s, would have contained a clause for adverse physical conditions, which would be described as conditions which an experienced contractor could not reasonably have been expected to anticipate. In other words, that he wasn't going to bottom out, he was going to have to dig almost indefinitely, and the scale of the works would have been vastly different. So
yes.
That invariably leads to tension, because, of course, the client never wants to pay the full cost. They want to try to minimize their expenditure, especially when it's extra to what they'd expected.
Yes.
One final question. In fact, if I could put a question to you, do you know where the clay for the dam core came from? Did it come out of the valley, or did they bring that in?
I don't know that. I wondered if it came out from when they were digging down, but no, I haven't seen any reference to that.
Yeah, okay, thank you. And apart from that, I mean, absolutely fascinating talk. And when it relates to something that we can all see so readily these days, it makes it even more interesting, doesn't
Yeah,
it?
well, thank you. And thanks for your extra comments.
Anybody else? Yes? No, you need to unmute yourself. Hang on. Hang on, unmute. There you go, sir.
Right, it's Norman Triggs.
Yes,
Hello.
Norman Triggs. You showed the picture of the drought in
Yes.
1934. I
Yes.
can well remember as a boy of 6 going down and standing on that bridge.
Can you?
Yes.
Interesting. So do you know where it was exactly?
Well, I think it was just a little footbridge across the stream, the original
Yes.
stream.
Yes.
Yes, as far as I remember.
Which end of the lake, do you know?
It was down just about opposite the fishing hut.
Oh, yes. Oh, not too far down
Yes,
then.
it wasn't very far up.
Mm, yes. Well,
As
there
far
must
as
have
I
been
can
lots of
remember.
footpaths. Yes.
Yes.
Oh, lovely.
Anybody else? Yes. Hang on. Hang on, Nick. Debbie, sorry. Nick, go on. Oh, hang on. Unmute. There you go, sir.
Right, yes, Nick Hutchins speaking. Wonderful talk, Jackie. Thank you very much. A lot of detail and really interesting. What I was going to ask you is, would you like to hazard a guess as to why it was that these contractors, and when you started your talk, you mentioned they didn't come from Bristol, or they didn't come from Blagdon, or anywhere around there. They were from all over the place.
Yes.
Was it that the expertise wasn't here, or do you think it was some other reason?
I don't know, because there was a mention that they weren't going to put tenders out to local companies deliberately. There was a case when they were looking at, I think it's when they got as far as the pumping station, and the Hodsons from Nottingham got it. The original tenders went out and the Bristol builders didn't want to tender because they said that the request was unreasonable, because the directors wanted not only an estimate of the cost, well, not an estimate, an actual amount, but also all the materials listed exactly. And they said that was unreasonable, and the Master Builders Association didn't agree with that sort of tendering. Yeah. So they wouldn't do it. And I think they did make some sort of concession in that they said, well, you can put in your tender, and if we take yours, then we shall expect you to, it'll be in a sealed envelope. We'll expect to open your envelope, which has got all the costings in it. Yeah. But no, whether there was some reason why Bristol builders didn't want to get involved, I don't know.
Even when you put those lists of navvies, they weren't local people. I mean, we weren't using labourers from around here. Forgetting the contractors, the actual labour force even come from a long way away.
Well, we were using some, but of course the ones in the huts tended to have been the ones who'd come from some distance away. Yes. There were quite a lot of local people who were labouring down there, but they were living in the villages.
They were living in the village, yes. Okay.
Yes, yes.
Anyway, jolly good talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nick.
Anybody else got any comments or questions?
Go on, I can't. I'm holding this. Please, Nick.
Please, if you press your space bar, I think that should unmute you.
Hello there.
Hi.
You're on mute, Mike.
Checking if it worked.
Yeah, Mike, you're on now.
Yeah, well done, Jackie. It was an amazing talk. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Wave your hand. I will happily unmute you if you can't unmute yourselves and you want to say something. Yes, go on then.
Am I unmuted? Ubley Mill, was that connected with the lake? And if so, what function did it have?
Well, I think it was not connected to the lake particularly, except that the head gillie, Donald Carr, lived there.
Right. So what was the,
So I guess it belonged to Bristol Water. They would have
Because-
bought it.
the tower that was there, the chimney?
Yes,
What was the history behind that?
I don't know, I'm afraid.
Right.
No.
Okay.
Mm.
I just
But I
wanted.
think Bristol Water would have bought the house and the land around it originally.
Okay. Thank you.
So that, but that lovely talk, Jacky.
Thank you.
The mill has the hatchery at the back of it,
Yes.
but the tower is historic and is much older. And we've always been led to believe that that was a button factory where they made buttons by melting down and casting lamb bones.
Oh, yes.
And
Yeah.
they would create a sort of glutinous glub that was then made into sticks that were turned on a lathe to make buttons.
Mm.
Ah, right. Thank
Well,
you.
that might work out because there was certainly shirt making
Yeah.
in the local villages, and buttons have been found under the floorboards. I think somewhere in Blagdon. Sheila will
Thank you.
remember where.
Good thought. Thank you.
It's lovely to have your talk, and we I'm sure lots of us have fond memories of seeing the beam engines going over
Yes,
when you
yes.
could go and have open days. We have a new neighbour recently arrived in West Town who works for as a consultant for the people who have bought Bristol Water, and this organisation, Southwest Lakes or whatever it's called, apparently, it remains to be seen, apparently have done a wonderful job in the Southwest Water territory, using the lakes and their natural assets for recreation and fishing and sailing and all sorts of things. Now, who knows what the plan is for the future, but we had supper with this chap the other night, and he was optimistic that they would be good as the new owners.
Oh,
So
good. Well, you can work on him. Have him for supper again.
Simon is his name, yeah. So watch this space.
Yeah, good. Well, it's such a wonderful thing down there, just shut away at the moment, isn't it? Nobody can get in there and see it. Such a shame.
We also heard historically, I think, lovely stories. Was it Sissy Filer who used to work at the tea shop? And somebody told me, it could have been Morris Bath, that they used to go down there and you would have tea on a Sunday, and they would go and take the water out of the lake and sieve it to get rid of the tadpoles before they cooked it
Made
and
the
make you your cup of tea.
We know the water was very pure.
Anyway, well done. Lovely talk. Thank you.
Good to see you.
Any more? The lovely story I heard about the pumping station when they'd taken out they were no longer using the beam engines properly, but they wanted to open up the pumping station for visitors, was that they put electric motors on the pumping engines so that people could see them going round when they went down to visit them. And when they first started doing that, some chap who had actually worked at the pumping station went up to one of the people organising the displays and said, "Excuse me," he says, "but you've actually got those engines going round the wrong way."
Right.
Anyway, that was Jacky. That was really fantastic. Thank you very much, and obviously very much appreciated. You actually hit 80 at one point of your
Really? Oh, that's
audience,
good.
which is tremendous. So thank you ever so much. And there will be a recording of the talk, and so anybody who wants to go through it again or recommend it to other people to watch or whatever, there will be a link shortly. And again, thank you very much for all turning up. I think Mike also sent out a link with the invitation, with an invitation for people who are not members of the society. If you feel like making a small contribution to the funds of the society, then there are details on that invitation that went out, and we would very much appreciate that. Thank you very much indeed. apart from that, thank you all for attending, and please come along. When's the next one, Jackie? I can't. Not till September, is it, or October?
October, yes. We've got Teresa Hall, who is she's done a lot of work around the Rington area with Mick Aston as well, who some of you will know. Archaeological investigations and digging pits and things like that. So she's going to come and talk to us about what they've done.
Okay.
In that area. Winscombe, sorry, I said Rington, Winscombe.
Okay,
Yeah.
jolly good.
Yeah.
Well, you're on our mailing list now, all of you, I think. So you will get details of that in due course. So,
Good. And if we want to go further, we've got one of our members, Nicholas Paynes, who was on here earlier on anyway. He may have gone now. He's talking to us in November about a Bristol ceramicist. Ceramics is his main interest, and there's a lot about the trade in Bristol.
Fantastic. Okay.
Bristol what? Ceramics.
Ceramics. Yep. Right. Okay. Lovely to see you all, and thank you very much for turning up.
Yep. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you,
Bye
Jack.
then.
Bye bye.
Goodbye. Yeah, well.
Great job, Jacky. Brilliant. Yeah.
No, thanks. I was just reading the chats on the side.
Those plans were lovely, weren't they? Those Bristol Waterworks plans.
Yes, yeah, they were good. Well, I think one is the same as Olga had, but I was just able to photograph them on. Yeah, really nice. Yeah, I'm surprised how well they show up on the screen, actually.
Yeah, no, it was really good. Yeah, it's really nice. Yeah, no, it was good. Excellent. Really well received by everybody. You know, it's really good.
Tremendous. No, it's really
It's, as you say, it's one of those things that's been with us for so long. We've never, you know, it's the first time we've had one of these, because we've had a sort of engineering talk in the past, haven't we? Which was a different angle on it, really. It's quite nice to see the human side of it. Yeah.
I see Nicholas has put a message on about what a banker mason is, because I said I wasn't sure. It's one who does the final preparation work on masonry blocks.
Okay.
Ah, right, there you go. Ah, right.
Okay.
Are you still there, Julie? I can see I can see lots of
I wondered if some of the reason for not employing bricklayers locally was possibly because of Will's using so many of them as well for all the building he was doing. You know, maybe there was.
Well, I suppose we hadn't got many local bricklayers because they were used to being masons rather than bricklayers. So perhaps there was quite a difference.
True.
Although you think they could turn their hand to both, but.
Yeah. Okay.
Hi Ben, nice to see you there.
Okay.
Enjoyed it.
Thank you, Andrew.
You do realise as well, don't you? Another thing, because of the building of the lake, that's where how we came to have all the Sampson family in Blagdon, like Flo Adicot's father and Sammy Sampson and all that. Their father walked up all the way up from Devon, I think it was, looking for work, and he met his wife in Buckham, and that was the mother of Sammy Sampson and Flo Adicot.
Oh, right.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, they had 11 children, I think, didn't they? Yes.
Yeah, I think so. Yes.
Yeah.
A few anyway. Yeah. Yeah, they all slept head to toe apparently in the bed as kids, as babies.
Yeah.
Apparently, in the paper shop, where the paper shop was, and they used to play tennis out in the road, and they used to put a piece of string across the road. The Flo used to say, one of their stories.
Fantastic. Right. Okay, all.
Yeah.
That's
Good night, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank
well
you.
done.
Thanks for your help.
Take care. Bye.
Bye bye.
Bye now. Thank you.